It's lovely to see so many people in your own way coming to the session today and hopefully learning a little bit about gut health and myasthenia and how these two things kind of interplay with one another. I wanted to start off and say a really big thank you to the support team because without them, we wouldn't have any of these online events ever because they do so much work behind the scenes to get them up and running. And that allows me just to kind of sweep in, ramble for 30 minutes, and come back out again quite happy. So thank you to them. And I'll see if this works. First test. Yep, cool. I can change my slides. There we go. So Sarah's kind of covered the majority of these sort of little bits of housekeeping before we get started. As I said, questions are going to be monitored. If you can hold them until the end, it's just really helpful for me because otherwise they'll pop up and I have a terrible attention span. So I don't get distracted and also because we're recording, it means that it won't pop up and block people's screens when they're reviewing this later. So that's great. And I will try my best to collate these questions and do a little bit of reading myself if I need to answer these as thoroughly as possible and hopefully get them back within 1 week. But if there are loads and loads of questions, then it might take a little bit longer. And then we'll get those shared on the Myaware website with the recording. And also, we'll share a PDF with all of the papers, academic papers that I've used to sort of compile this information together. And if anybody, these will always be academic papers and not really broken down into lay language. So if anyone's reading through them and find they're struggling a bit to understand what they're talking about, please always feel free to get in contact with me. I'm more than happy to talk science with folk and try and break it down. Which then leads me to my last point, which is that I'm not a medical doctor, I am a scientist. And so while we're going to talk about topics related to health and well-being and tips that can maybe help with myasthenic symptoms, please always keep in mind that I'm not qualified to give medical advice. I'm qualified to look at complicated topics and help sort of break them down into lay language. And that's kind of what we always try and do at the charity is take complicated bits of myasthenia and make the understanding accessible for everybody. So yes, please, if you're going to make any drastic changes based on information you've heard today, then always consult with a doctor first and foremost. Okay, so without further ado and without the boring bits out of the way, we will talk about what we're going to cover, which is, age-old saying, you are what you eat. We're going to look at the bacteria involved in your body system and how they help break down what you eat, and then how they then use that sort of breakdown of materials into helping with lots of other systems in the body, like sleep and mood and the immune system, most importantly, and taking those messages and working out how does this maybe link with myasthenia. So we'll try our best to keep things accessible and also understandable for everybody. But again, if there's anything that seems still way too complicated to understand, just feel free to get in touch and we'll try our best to do a little bit better because we're always seeking to be better communicators. So we're going to start with the age-old saying of you are what you eat. And as it turns out, when I was researching for this presentation, there's actually a lot of scientific meaning behind that. And we're going to discuss it as we go through these slides. So, topics that we're going to cover with regard to gut health and its sort of overarching influence on the body includes its effect on maintaining control of the immune response, strengthening the gut lining, which we're going to focus on quite a bit, the cyclical benefits of good sleep pattern, and how also mental health can be an underlying influence on this system. So, hopefully, as we go through these slides, you're going to see that there's a little bit of sort of interplay and cross communication between lots of different processes the body goes through, and how diet kind of sits a little bit central on a lot of these. So, we're going to do a little bit of science here, which I apologize for the complicated little diagrams here, but I'm going to break it down as best I can. We're going to look at a little bit of biochemistry first and how food breaks down into products that helps us with all the sort of topics we discussed on the last slide. So things like mental and sleep health, inflammation, and gut strength. And first, we're going to look at tyrosine, which is something we refer to as a non-essential amino acid. And what that means, as it says on the tin, is that it is not essential to bodily function, but it certainly helps with different processes. Kind of like you can imagine it as an assistant to the body. And it is brought into your system by food like cheese, which I've included a picture of here, mostly to keep Sarah awake because that was just a special shout out to her as our resident cheese expert at Myaware. Um, but it can also be found in other food groups, such as fish and legumes. And what this complicated looking little image up here is, it basically shows us what tyrosine looks like if we zoomed in really, really, really close to see what sort of elements make it up. And for example, if you see this ring here, this is basically just a collection of carbon. And what we can see is there's also some nitrogen and hydrogen in there too. And this overall shape is called a chemical structure. And that's because it basically does just that. It shows you how the chemical elements are involved, how they fit together, and what shape they take, which can change depending on function. So when tyrosine is taken into the body, it undergoes a couple of changes. It gains some oxygen, loses some carbon dioxide. And when it does that, it becomes a different chemical altogether, which is one called dopamine, which acts as a bit of a messenger for the body. So you might have heard of what dopamine does, but it basically, in its messenger form, sends like a signal to the brain that helps with our ability to feel motivated, and it also plays a role in movement control. Now, dopamine can undergo a few more changes in the body to become something called norepinephrine. Another word for that one is, or less fancier one, is noradrenaline. And basically, what noradrenaline does is dictates the body's fight or flight response, but it also can modulate heart rate, attention span, very helpful for me, but also alertness and blood pressure. So, finally, one more change to norepinephrine, which allows it to be epinephrine. Again, less fancy word is adrenaline, which I hope we've all heard of. And adrenaline, as we know, is a hormone that functions to basically act as another messenger for the brain. It can influence, again, heart rate, breathing, blood flow to muscles, and energy availability. And we might be thinking right now about how these processes that this messenger is involved with could also play a sort of parallel role in some of the symptoms we see in myasthenia gravis, particularly with, movement control and also blood flow to muscles. So next slide. We're going to look at one more amino acid. This one is called tryptophan, but this one is essential to survivability. And it's also brought to the body through food, specifically talking about things like turkey, chicken, eggs, nuts, and seeds. And again, we've got another semi-complicated looking chemical structure here, and it undergoes another few changes to the body. And essentially, what tryptophan does is it eventually becomes another chemical messenger, or a fancier word for it is a neurotransmitter, one that is particularly called serotonin. And serotonin is kind of known as like sort of the happy molecule of the body. It sends information to the brain and plays a role in regulating our mood, our appetite, and our digestion. And what's really cool is that the body has something called the circadian rhythm, where it can detect changes in light. It kind of knows when the sun's going down, when the world's getting a little bit darker. And the body takes that as a signal to take tryptophan or take serotonin and turn it into another hormone called melatonin, which some people may have heard about. But melatonin has a really key role in helping regulate sleep. So therefore, serotonin kind of knows, because of signals in the body, to turn that into melatonin when it detects it's getting dark out, and helps us have a better sort of sleep cycle and be more likely to get a good sleep. So you can kind of see how these different food groups play a different role in modulating different parts of our health. We're almost through with the chemical structures, and then we'll be rid of them for a while. But one more I wanted to look at is indole 3 lactic acid, or ILA, if you wanted just to break it down a wee bit. And what ILA is, it's actually a product of tryptophan, which we just talked about on the last slide. And when tryptophan comes into the body, it can be broken down by the bacteria in our gut and turned into ILA. And it plays a particularly important role in improving gut health by supporting the gut lining, which helps prevent bad bacteria or inflammatory molecules from leaking out. It can also help regulate the immune response, as it activates a signaling pathway in the body that encourages immune tolerance. So when we talk about immune tolerance, we're thinking about the body's ability to see a foreign material come in and identify it as something that doesn't belong. It's not meant to be there. So if it's something like a bad bacteria or a pathogen, it knows then to signal that it needs to kind of be taken care of. when we talk about tolerance, there's also an element of when the body mistakes something that's very much meant to be there for something that it isn't. And so that's where we come with autoimmunity, is when the body starts to attack itself. So ILA plays a key role in helping to regulate that response. It also plays a role in reducing excessive inflammation. And inflammation is basically the body's way of putting basically a red flag up to an area where they think there is maybe some dangerous material afoot and that the body needs to come in and get rid of it. So, again, all these chemicals, things that are taken in from food, you can see where they're maybe playing a role in immune health. So, something else in the diet that can be taken, which is of great benefit that I have now read a lot about in the run up to this presentation, is fiber. And why fiber is important is actually the human body can't really digest it properly, and that's where the gut bacteria come in. They are more than capable of digesting it, and when they do that, they produce something that we call short chain fatty acids, which, as the name suggests, are small fatty acid molecules, and they're important for providing energy for cells in your colon. So this little molecule here is called ATP. That basically acts like a little bit of a battery for the body and supplies energy for different processes. It also helps with controlling inflammation by increasing the production of immune cells called T cells. And it also affects metabolism, and that it's been shown to help improve insulin sensitivity and energy expenditure. I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to talk a lot about fiber in this talk. So everyone might be in their head adjusting their dinner plans. Maybe start thinking about including a nice spoonful of lentil or beans somewhere here and there. It will be good for you, I hope, or at least make it tasty in some way. But what we also need to think about is the body itself. And another important message to take away from this talk is that nothing in the body works in silo. Different players interact and coordinate and even adapt in response to how other parts of the body are working. And this is especially true in terms of the connection between the brain and the guts, and by extension, the microbiota, which is a fancy word for just all the bacteria that are found in your gut. So it's kind of like all the collections of different families of bacteria. You can just summarize that all into the word microbiota. And basically, for example, if we're trying to think about how the gut and the brain can sometimes work together, there may be people on this call, myself included, when we're feeling particularly stressed or anxious, you can get a sore tummy. This is actually a really practical example of the connection between your brain and your gut. And the MGB, it acts as a sort of axis of communication with a system that incorporates lots of different neurological reflexes and moderates the coordination between your brain, intestinal tract, your endocrine system, and your immune systems, and all the things that are involved in maintaining gut function. So, as we've discussed, the bacteria in your gut can break down food products into chemical messengers or neurotransmitters such as adrenaline and serotonin to give the brain messages, which can do things like improve mood and energy. And so, what regulates this communication hub, this sort of gut brain axis? Well, a number of factors ranging from things like genetics to environment to even delivery method, for example. There is literature that suggests there's a difference in the gut microbiota of babies born vaginally versus C-section, for example. And I think the main point of this slide is to really emphasize that not everything is within our control when it comes to our microbiota, but there are certainly some factors like diet where we can have some say and hopefully encourage some better function and better results. So we've spoken a lot about gut bacteria and microbiota, but where do they belong other than the gut? The microbiome is defined as the ecological community of microorganisms, which is essentially things like bacteria, sometimes yeasts, and they can be described as either commensal, which means that they're neither harming nor helping a host. They can also be described as symbiotic, which means that they are providing mutual help between host and bacteria, or pathogenic, which is a word we use to describe an organism that's capable of causing disease. And this community can be considered to be a determinant of health and disease for reasons we're going to discuss in further slides. And just to kind of get a measure of how many microorganisms people have in their body, this number here, I believe, is 10 billion, and this number here is a trillion. So between 10 billion and a trillion live microorganisms exist per gram of the human colon. And according to Google, the average human colon weighs between 350 and 500 grams. So if you can do the math, I think the answer is there's a lot. And we don't even realize that they're at work half the time. So the microbiota in literature has been suggested to play a role in the development of diseases, all of which are kind of shown in this diagram here. However, it's really difficult to nail down exactly how involved the microbiota is due to kind of the complexity of the system and the fact that, as of yet, scientists are still unable to define what an ideal microbiota looks like or use microbiota composition to predict disease. These are all sort of future research that people are looking at. So while we can see how two things may be linked, we must always be a little bit wary on whether something is showing a causal relationship or an association without correlation. And to do this, we need more careful, mechanistic research on how this works. And as these things come out, I'll be sure to update the Myaware website as we go along. In terms of function, the microbiome is capable of a lot of tasks, some of which we've discussed already. For example, the gut bacteria help maintain a barrier that exists to prevent harmful microbes passing through, and it can also produce antimicrobial substances to keep the sort of environment clean. Certain bacteria also produce essential vitamins like B12, which I know there's been a lot of talk about. And I won't go into too much detail on the immune system development as I'm going to discuss this further on. But in terms of promotion of intestinal angiogenesis, what this simply means is that gut bacteria stimulate the growth of blood vessels in the intestine, which improves nutrient absorption. And short chain fatty acids we've spoken about, and the gut brain axis, so we'll leave them as they are. They'll probably come up again in further slides. What I thought was a really interesting case is sort of looking at how these gut bacteria can adapt really quickly or in response to changes in their environment. And so there have been studies that have shown that the microbiome, when they compare that of elite athletes to someone who's very much not an elite athlete, is that there's pretty clear difference in sort of the diversity and the number of bacterial species that an athlete has in comparison to the average person. And this is because these bacteria need to be able to respond to strictly controlled diets and training regimes, and they need to be able to adapt to carry out the roles they need to do this with high efficiency. So they basically become more effective at breaking down food into beneficial metabolites, which is the little bits that we take out of food that help us, and also burning energy only when needed. An important note is that the diversity of these highly efficient gut bacteria means that, as I said, there are lots of different species involved. So there are it's almost like a factory. You've got lots of workers who are capable of doing different roles, different specialties, and they're all working together really efficiently. So it's interesting to think about how lifestyle changes can affect the microbiome. And I'm not asking everybody to become a professional athlete by any means, but I think even small bits that we can get done in terms of exercise can have a positive effect. I also sort of spoke about bacteria adapting to carry out certain jobs or switching off when they're not needed to preserve energy. But there's a lot to be said for volume and the certain types of bacteria and how the size of that community in your gut changes based on diet. Depending on what is consumed more, whether it be protein or fiber, bacteria will respond accordingly. And when I say protein, I don't necessarily mean all meat, but other sources like dairy can also be thought of. And if anything, what I would really emphasize with this slide is the importance of keeping a balance between protein and fiber, and also that it's never too late to change this or make positive changes towards this balance because the body is really capable of responding to this and adapting where needed. So I'm not saying anybody needs to have a completely protein-rich diet or a plant-rich diet, depending on, what they're trying to improve, sort of internally. But balance is really important, and having the best of both worlds is really key to having a good and healthy microbiome. And speaking of adaptation, this flexibility goes right down to the genome of gut bacteria. And the genetic infrastructure of bacteria are basically very highly adaptive and large, which means that bacteria are capable of sensing changes in your diet because of these genes, and switching those genes on and off accordingly, depending on the material that they're looking to break down. This is really important in ensuring that energy is used efficiently in the body and not wasted, as that is very key to most of our sort of internal processes, is the being highly efficient and doing our jobs very, very well. So something else to keep in mind is that it's literally written into bacteria how to do this, and they're usually very good at it. I thought it would also be good to sort of highlight the differences between what we refer to as good and bad bacteria, as these are phrases that are often used without much context as to what they actually do. So, probiotics are microorganisms, mostly bacteria, but they can also be yeast. And they largely help with food digestion, vitamin production, release of short chain fatty acids, as we discussed. And on the other side, we've got pathogens, which are microorganisms that can invade tissues and produce toxins or trigger excessive inflammation. And this is usually what causes an immune response. What is important to remember is that not everything is black and white when it comes to bacteria in the gut. Some can be very helpful in one place and a hindrance in another. For example, E. coli resides really quite happily in the gut and contributes to that diversity that we're kind of highlighting as really important. But if it moves somewhere else, say the urinary tract, it will cause something like a UTI. So, in short, good and bad are relative terms for bacteria, particularly those found in the gut. And it's important to sort of understand the difference between both when people talk about good and healthy and bad bacteria. It is also sometimes quite relative. Finally, we're going to start moving on to autoimmunity, as I think we've laid out a nice foundation for the role of the gut in the immune response, and we're going to build on that a little bit more. I'm going to introduce a new term, which is dysbiosis. And basically, what this means is a term given when there isn't a lot of diversity in the microbiota of a person. So, for example, they might have too much of one type of bacteria, maybe the type that's specialized to break down protein. So, maybe they have a very protein rich diet, don't take in too many vegetables. And as a result, they've not got a lot of those bacteria needed to break down fiber. And with the gut's role in maintaining balance using some of the products broken down from fiber, it means that there's an imbalance in your bacteria or microbiome, and there's likely going to be a lack of control in the immune response and a higher likelihood that the gut lining isn't well maintained, which can result in leaks. So, to help illustrate this a little bit better, I'm going to use this diagram. Um, and what the top of this diagram shows here is the gut lumen, which is the layer where microbes and bacteria live. The bottom depicts the underlying processing of players involved in the immune response found in the gut tissue. And what this diagram essentially shows is how microbes can cross a weakened gut tissue or weakened gut barrier and activate immune cells, leading to different immune outcomes. We can see here gut pathogens and oral microbes passing through this barrier and activating a number of cells that play a role in the immune response. These innate cells are activated in response to the arrival of the pathogen. They'll identify when it enters and they'll start responding accordingly. So we've got these DC cells or dendritic cells, and basically their job is to detect the pathogens first and foremost and activate an inflammatory response. We've got a selection of T cells here as well, and we've got Th1, which is involved in inflammation and pathogen killing, Th17, which is involved also in inflammation and autoimmunity. Then we have TFH or T helper cells, and they activate B cells. And finally, we've got Treg or regulatory T cells, which suppress the immune response in comparison. So that's what this red line here means. And by suppressing the immune response, they help maintain tolerance, essentially acting as anti-inflammatories, where these more act as inflammatory agents. So maintaining balance between the actions of Th1 and Th17 in comparison to Treg cells is really crucial to making sure that one pathway isn't on necessarily. And what happens when B cells are activated by the helper cells is they produce these antibodies, as we can see here. And if we wanted to throw this into the context of MG, I'll pop this into the next slide, which describes this a little bit better. If we compare it to the diagram we just went through, we can kind of see that this gut is again experiencing that word dysbiosis, meaning that we're seeing a lower number of one certain type of bacteria, which is what the little red downward arrow means. In this case, it's Clostridium, which plays a role in the production of short chain fatty acids. So we've got fewer of these in the body. And we know that short chain fatty acids play a role in maintaining a healthy gut lining. With this being disrupted, it means that we're getting sort of an absorption or a passage of these bacteria through the gut lumen, and then triggering an immune response. In this case, it is a pro-inflammatory response, which means that antibodies are being produced by B cells, and in this case, because we're talking about MG, it's producing antibodies against the acetylcholine receptor. So that's taking that previous bigger diagram and putting it in the context of MG. So hopefully it's starting to make a little bit of sense where these things can sort of intertwine. So if everybody is still with me, you're doing very, very well, and we're getting there. We're now going to start beginning rounding things off a bit with a few studies that specifically look at the microbiome of MG patients. And I will start off by sincerely apologizing because, as is the case with a lot of research, there is a high focus on MG. There isn't a whole lot in the literature in terms of LEMS focused or CMS focused studies. And so I've kind of just had to go with what was available to me. But as soon as anything like this does come up, I'll make sure to, again, update the Myaware website accordingly. So this first study, which was named the MyBiome study, took place in 2021, and it looked at 41 myasthenia gravis patients, 24 patients with a different type of inflammatory neuropathy disease, and 12 control patients, which were people who didn't have an autoimmune disease. Interestingly, by comparing the microbiome of the MG and other autoimmune patients, they found that there was no real difference in the diversity level between the two samples. However, when comparing the MG patient samples to those in the control, so people without an autoimmune disease, they found there was distinct differences in that the control group presented more diversity in its microbiome, therefore better balance and a more controlled immune response. And like I said, the paper relating to these studies, I'll make sure that these are all uploaded to the Myaware website so you can read them in your own time. I thought I'd also include a second study just to make sure and sort of reinforce the result. This time, a much more recent one in 2026, which looked at a similar composition of samples. Again, myasthenia gravis versus control, people without an autoimmune disease. And again, they found this lower diversity in the myasthenia gravis group. The study also looked more closely at metabolites, so the products that are produced by gut bacteria when digesting food, and they found a reduction in these metabolites, specifically looking at short chain fatty acids, the same players we've been discussing, altered bile acids, and also reduced ILA, which again we discussed earlier. So it's all starting to come together a little bit. And these lowered metabolite numbers also occurred in tandem with gut barrier damage and immune imbalance. So, the last study I'm going to talk about is a 2023 study, and it looked at a very important question. So, a lot of MG patients often take antibiotics to control their symptoms. And what effects does this have on the diversity of gut bacteria? Because often when we take an antibiotic, it can kind of wipe the playing field in terms of our microbiome. A lot of those species might get killed off by the antibiotic, and we've got to spend some time building that diversity up again. So is this lack of diversity because of antibiotic treatment, or did it exist before diagnosis? So this 2023 study looked at untreated MG patients, so they hadn't been given antibiotics yet as part of their treatment, or at the very least, it isn't clear, definitely not antibiotics, but they also didn't sort of include what else they were treated with, so it's hard to compare. But what is important is that it did show that comparatively, there was still this difference in microbiota diversity between the controls and the MG patients, suggesting that this imbalance existed before treatment. Now, this is looking at a relatively small study, and it would need to be repeated with more controls in place because while we know these MG patients weren't treated with antibiotics for their MG, they may have been historically treated with antibiotics. And so it's interesting to consider exactly where does this lack of diversity start and what can be done to correct it. And this is just a slide that I thought kind of helpfully summarized everything we talked about in the last couple of slides. If anybody wants a copy of the diagram, then I'm more than happy to share. But it kind of summarizes things step by step, looking at diet and how diet can inform for diversity in gut bacteria, how a reduction in diversity, such as, lowering the number of bacteria that break down fiber and a raise in bacteria that break down protein can result in different metabolites being in the system, different levels of metabolites, how this has sort of an intrinsic effect on the gut health and allowing microbes and toxins to enter the bloodstream, which can then trigger immune effects, and again, a loss of tolerance, which then leads to an autoimmune effect. And then how this then finally all ties into something like myasthenia gravis and the symptoms we see, such as impaired neuromuscular signaling, muscle weakness, fatigue, etc. So almost there. Um, I think I just wanted to put a sort of how to improve microbiota diversity now that you understand absolutely everything about it. I hope this presentation has been given you at least a bit of comfort that there is doable things to do and quick wins to have. One that I think is at least introducing more fiber into the diet, at least. Also, a fermented food such as natural yogurt and pickles. Prebiotics function to feed the good bacteria in your gut and can also help them do their job more efficiently. This presentation, if nothing else, has been really important to me to finally understand what on earth the occult does, because I never knew. And after many years of watching adverts on TV, I now understand that Yakult is a probiotic, which means that it introduces an additional bacterial species into your gut. In this case, L. casei shirota, as you can see at the bottom of the bottle. And it therefore, by adding a new species into your gut, it's increasing the diversity because you've got more out there. But the snag is, and probably the business case for Yakult is that you do need to keep drinking it because eventually that species will get washed out. So you need to keep consistently drinking the Yakult if you want to keep the diversity going. I won't talk too much on mindfulness because that's going to be covered extremely well by Dr. Wong next week. But hopefully, some of the bits and pieces that we've learned today will help prep for that talk, which I really hope. And as I said on the slide about elite athletes, exercise if you can. It's totally understandable. It's not possible a lot of the time, especially with the muscle fatigue and the spontaneity of some symptoms of myasthenia. But as Tesco says, every little helps, and there is no harm in trying if you can. So, summary and take home messages. The microbiome, which I've said way too many times in this presentation, but it refers to the bacterial environment between your mouth and colon. It plays a role in the overall health, adaptiveness, and the immune system. Hopefully, you all agree. The benefits of a balanced diet are layered in that they can affect different parts of day-to-day life, whether that be sleep, mood, immune system, all these things that all interplay together in some way. And finally, that fiber is really, really good for you. So if you can take more fiber into your diets, then please, by all means, go ahead. And I think that's me. So thank you again for all your attention. I appreciate that might have been a little too sciencey. Hopefully it was okay. And yeah, thank you again for joining us on this starter for our Myasthenia Awareness Month.